Okay, my name is Waldo E. Martin Jr. I'm the Morrison Professor of American History and Citizenship at the University of California at Berkeley. I teach courses in African American history, modern U.S. history, and American cultures. And at the present, I'm working on a book on sort of the cultural politics of civil rights and Black Power, and the project Black Against Empire came out of a series of conversations with a former student of mine who now has a PhD in sociology, Joshua Bloom. And it was not a book that I set out to write, so it emerged out of our own efforts to try to think through sort of radical Black politics in the late 60s and early 70s. He and I knew a number of members of the party or former members of the party, and we'd had conversations, especially Josh, with some of them, and it was very clear that what we wanted to do was sometimes different from what they wanted. We wanted a very sober, scholarly treatment of the party, as balanced as you can make a history of such a controversial organization. And so the way it all started was he took a series of courses with me as an undergraduate, and we were not at that point. This was in the early 2000s. We were not thinking about writing a book at all. But it was very clear that we shared a lot of scholarly and intellectual concerns. It was also clear to me that he was brilliant, very driven, highly motivated, and he did an MA thesis at Berkeley, and then he made the decision that he would become a sociologist and not a historian. By that time, we'd done 2 research projects, and these, I think, were the turning point, because out of those 2 research projects came the idea of writing the book. One was the Ewen collection, Y-U-E-N. H.K. Ewen was a local Chinese-American activist in the Bay Area who took it upon himself to try to document sort of Bay Area social movements. And this took the form of audio taping as much as he could, videotaping as much as he could, attending as many rallies as he could, and just trying to get it all down, from the radio, from live performances, or speeches, rallies, and he would also, if there was any pamphlet, literature, anything at the protest or anything associated with the event, he would gather all that, newspapers and all of that. So essentially the collection, which was in his home, had overtaken the home, and Josh knew his son, and Josh arranged with the son to try to make some sense of what the collection was. And as we were going through the collection, and Josh and I created a series of research projects where essentially we hired mostly undergraduate research assistants, but some graduate student research assistants to help us to put the materials in order. And so we worked on that for several years, and in the process of doing that, we also became very interested in a complete run of the Black Panther Party newspaper, trying to create one. And so we did a lot of legwork, tried to, and located as many copies of the paper as we could, and created a sort of virtually a full run of the newspaper. And it was put online by Alexander Press, and Now I think it's in a different mode. I'm not quite sure if you can just get it from Alexander Press, but as a result of that, that's sort of like trying to create a full run of the newspaper and sort of trying to make sense of the Ewan collection. We came to the conclusion that we already had amassed a lot of information about Bay Area social movements. The Ewing collection is interesting because it's not about any one thing in particular, but it's about a lot of things. So, yeah, mostly sort of radical third world politics, Asian American stuff, farm worker stuff, women's movement stuff, and sort of the material that really jumped out at us as particularly rich was a lot of stuff that he had on the Black Panther Party. He just had a lot of stuff. So what we were able to do was ultimately.
Well, we'll start with So, what were some of your biggest challenges with this topic, in terms of research or writing?
Okay. So I remember now. So we did the Ewan collection, then we did the Black Panther Party newspaper, and then coming out of the Ewan collection, we were totally fascinated with how the party was not an isolated phenomenon, but the party was part of an extraordinary array of political and social movements, and how a lot of these movements interacted with and played off of one another. And so we were also fascinated with sort of the way in which Ewan had put the newspaper at various points in the collection to illuminate different events that he documented. And so that's one of the reasons we decided we'd like to see what a full run of the newspaper looked like. I would say about 10 years ago, around 2005, we thought about what the scholarship on the party looked like, and we decided that even though there was a growing body of scholarship, and that a good book about the party's history, especially sort of the whole of the party, and the party as a party, might be useful. So we surveyed over the next several months all the literature we could find, and this would include not only scholarly sort of accounts, but master's theses, PhD dissertations, sort of popular treatments of the party, autobiographies, memoirs, biographies, and principles. And we read all this material over a year or so, and decided that we thought we could make some sense of this. And in the meantime, we engaged a variety of graduate students and undergraduates to help us with some of the research. I think in terms of problems, we had a particular difficulty with the design around oral interviews. The original design of the project would have had us look at the party from various angles, especially from the position of the rank and file. We wanted to interview a lot of rank and file members. We also thought we would like to interview a lot of party members outside of Oakland, around the country. But we worked at this for a while, over a year, and decided that our design was not going to produce a book anytime soon. The problems were, some of them were political and personal. You talk to one person, another person won't talk to you, so we ran it. We anticipated that, but and that proved to be much more of an issue than we ever anticipated. We did not have, we could not generate the kind of money to pay for, subsidize the grand vision of doing, the national party in all these different locations. And so we decided that we would work with pre-existing interviews of members or important people who talked about the party. And what we found was that it was an extraordinary array, especially locally. Most people had, and you knew that had been transcribed and was often part of a local archive that we were able to get to, including the Bancroft Library, which is the principal research library at the University of California in Berkeley, and sort of the Open Public Library and some other libraries. And then we did do some interviews, so we were able to use that. But I think that was probably, in terms of the design and execution of the project, the most difficult thing. And to this day, we have an idea about doing a book that centers the experiences of the rank and file, that centers the experiences of the foot soldiers in the party. Because I don't think that a lot of people don't quite understand that the work of the party, this is where the work of the party was, this is where the bulk of the time, effort, and money and everything was spent. And they were the ones who did, created the programs, sort of tried to execute the programs, often with success. And so we were really interested in that, and really interested in how it played itself out in different cities around the country. Since we weren't able to complete that sort of oral history vision, we tried to dig as deeply into the written archive as we could. We relied a lot on the newspaper because the newspaper is the mouthpiece of the party, but we also relied on a whole range of other newspapers around the country, especially the New York Times and a few others, and local Bay Area newspapers. And so I think another sort of issue in doing work on the party is that the received wisdom about the party is pretty negative, and in our way of thinking is not at all balanced. And so what we tried to do was to provide what we would call a corrective, a revisionist account that while not ignoring the problems and the pitfalls and the perils and the errors, also tries to think about what the party actually did, what it actually tried to do, and rather than sort of unduly criticizing the party for what it did not try to do and what it did not do. If to be critical, you have to have a sense of what the party was actually trying to do. So we try to present as full a picture of that as possible, so we can be fair to the party when we sort of criticize it. But I think ultimately, so there's sort of the popular misconceptions about, there are popular misconceptions about party. Then I think the official government vilification of the party plays into how scholars and the popular, how people in general think about the party. So we try to take seriously the problem of writing against that grain and trying to write a book that sort of tried to argue a different kind of view of the party, which I think is more sensitive, which is more nuanced, and where we try to be balanced. But I think our idea is that in its conception and in its ideas and in sort of its rhetoric and practices, a lot of the stuff that the party is saying and doing is actually quite important and serious and necessary and good. And so we try to say as much because I think the Black Power period in particular and the Black Party are often not seen as part of a move forward. It's often seen as sort of like the civil rights movement. It's sort of like everything is going along, and all of a sudden it becomes Black Power and Black Panthers and urban rebellions, and they set everything back. And so we didn't have that view at all. We don't see it as part of a fragmentation or unraveling. To the degree you can talk about fragmentation and unraveling, it starts before the party and proceeds after and continues after the party. So what we try to do is to put the party in a context, sort of scholarship, of interpretation that takes it seriously, is balanced and very, very sensitive to sort of the moment. And I would say the last thing about all of this is the late 60s, early 70s was a very different historical moment from our own. And to understand the party, I think you have to, as accurately, as fully as possible, recreate that historical moment and put the party in that moment and help readers in today's world understand how, why, and with what consequences people thought that there might be a revolution, because the sense that there was revolution was in the air, that radical change was possible. This was palpable. This was real, and I think we had to recreate that moment and put the party in that moment, and try to help readers today understand how different that moment was. I think that was not necessarily a research challenge, but it was definitely a writing challenge and a narrative challenge.
So fascinating. And so I'm a historian of the 1970s, so I understand the difficulties. But so if you can think back, when did you know you were a historian? When did you,
I'm still trying to figure that out. Let me put it to you this way. I don't even think I knew what a historian really was until I went to college. And I didn't have a good sense, probably, of what a historian was until I began to take history seriously. And so that would not have been until my sophomore, junior year in college. And when I became a history major, and then by my sophomore year, then my junior year, you had to take a year-long sequence in a topic, and I took a year-long sequence in 19th century political history with Robert Durden at the University at Duke. And after that, it was clear to me what historiography was, what popular history was, how, what PhDs did, and all this other kind of stuff. And my senior year, I was either going to go to law school or go to graduate school in history. And since I wasn't really interested in law and opted to go to graduate school, I think that sort of was the path. By then, the path was clearer to me. But I can honestly say that up until my sophomore year, I didn't know really what I was doing, because I came in to college, with all kinds of ideas about what I might want to do, including a math major. I don't know where that idea came from, but I was quickly disabused of that error. And the other thing that probably I have to mention, because I think this is where the light went off. I took the course that really put me on the path, I guess, is the thing to talk about. I took 2-semester sequence in African American history at Duke. This would have to be it would have to be my sophomore year. So that would be 1970, the fall of 71, the spring of 71. And I took it with Dr. Raymond Gavins, and it was his first class at Duke, and I was in that inaugural class. And I think, and we were, 70, 71. My memory of the class, like we had a textbook, from slavery to freedom with John Hope Franklin, and we read a series of important articles and books, and I just totally enjoyed it. And so but it wasn't clear to me then that I might want to do that, but that was my sophomore year. Then I took another, when I started taking history seriously my junior year, then it became clear that, well, okay, I sort of like this, people tell me I'm sort of good at this, maybe this can work for me. So I think that's sort of how it happened. And graduate school is its own world. So I went to Berkeley for 8 years. I was there from 73 to, I finished in 80, then I had a postdoc there for another year.
So you were in the middle of all this.
Well, let me put it this way. I arrived in Berkeley in 73 when the party was basically it had become the Oakland chapter again. They quote unquote closed down the other chapters, and they were focusing on electoral politics and trying to do things in Oakland, take over Oakland and all of that. And my memory of all of that is that is very exciting. I went to some rallies. I was not, how do I put this? I knew the Black Panther Party from North Carolina because it was a very active chapter in Winston-Salem, and some of the politics in, at Duke and stuff, anti-war stuff and anti-draft stuff, labor organizing and all this other kind of stuff, including Black Power politics, Black student politics at Duke. That put me in contact with a whole range of people, and the work that the Black Panther Party was doing in Winston, people were very, very much aware of. So I knew about the party, and plus all the events like the Sacramento, where they go with the guns down in Sacramento. That was very much a part of knowledge that I had about the party, and so I had sort of a sense of what the party was, and I myself was always deeply impressed with what I knew, but I didn't really know a lot on the ground. And when I got to Oakland, the party was still doing all kinds of interesting and important work, and so I got to observe a lot of that. As I said, I'm a rally goer. I love these kinds of things. So some of those moments I participated in, but I also witnessed sort of the years of. I was there for sort of what I would call the decline of the party in the late 70s. The party still was doing important work. I knew mostly, and we write about this, the school that they ran. And they were doing some other kind of stuff, especially political outreach and solidarity work. But by then the party was a shell of its former self. And so by the time I left in 81, the party the party was more or less, I didn't quite know it then when I was leaving, but the party was more or less defunct. And so I was basically working on the book that I'm working on now, sort of a book on cultural politics, sort of how the cultural struggle and the political struggle in the 60s and 70s fit together. that's the book I was working on when Josh and I began the sort of and completed the Black Panther Party book. And so it's the book that I return to and hope to finish soon.
Can you talk a little bit more about the current project?
The current project goes in too many different directions at once. That's one of the reasons it's never been finished. But I'm really interested in sort of what's sometimes called the Black Arts movement in the late 60s and 70s, where culture and politics really cross and fertilize and have this mutual impact. And I see this as part of a kind of struggle that's very important to thinking about the Black freedom struggle in general. I think there are, my way of thinking about it, you can struggle in a lot of different areas, and they're all related. You know, economic struggle, political struggle, social struggle, cultural struggle, and obviously I mentioned political, but all these ways that people can figure out sort of tactics and strategies to try to promote sort of Black freedom. And culture to me has always been one of these things very, very important.
So do you mean like the Pan-African movement? And
Pan-Africanism would be a part of it. And the way a lot of people can really get a handle on this is they think about the Harlem Renaissance, they think about or what's sometimes called the New Negro Renaissance: art, poetry, fiction, visual arts, sort of cultural production that's aimed at at advancing the race, or providing a fuller, more accurate representation of the race, that kind of thing. But also music, scholarship.
So like your Nina Simone's and...
Oh, Nina would, all of that would be very much a part of it. I have a little book of essays called No Coward Soldiers: Black Cultural Politics in Post-War America. This was a series of lectures that I gave before I really got into the Black Panther Party book, but I think I gave them in around 2001 at the Du Bois Center at Harvard, and I think they were published in '04 or '05, somewhere in there. And they give an overview kind of thing I'm interested in. I think there's an introductory essay thinking about the relationship between American identity and African American identity, and sort of try to complicate it. It's not just two-ness. Am I an African? Am I an American? Or am I Black or a Negro? And am I an American? What does all of this mean? I'm really interested in sort of the idea that American at its core is a diverse, multifaceted kind of idea. There is no, and that's the way African Americans thought about it. So they didn't, becoming American isn't this idea of becoming white or anything else. American is at the core of a lot of what Black people are. And then there's an essay about the music, because I think the music, for me, the music is one of the most original and revealing windows onto African American consciousness. And so when you mentioned Nina, people like Nina Simone are huge in that genre. And I do a little bit with people who do who have who do some stuff like I think Aretha's Respect and some of her Think and some of her stuff. Obviously James Brown. There are a whole bunch of people who are doing political music. And so that's sort of. But I'm really interested in music as a genre and as a mode of expression and as a mode of cultural production and what it can tell us about how Black people think and feel. And then I think the final essay, as I remember it, is mostly about other sort of aspects of cultural production and culture. There's some sports history in there. There's some history of visual art. And those are the two that jump out at me. Because I'm really interested in sort of formal visual art, painters and installation artists, people doing all kinds of visual stuff. And then sort of the other aspect of culture that, especially from a popular cultural point of view, I was very interested in was the sort of what Harry Edwards called the revolt of the black athlete, and sort of thinking about sort of sports and politics, and in the late 60s and early 70s. And so I had an enduring interest in that kind of stuff, and then I did the Black Panther Party. Then I'm going back to pick up the black culture politics stuff. And my idea is that I'm just gonna, I have a lot of stuff on my desk, so I'm gonna go through and pull some stuff together. But just say, for example, one piece I can sort of talk about because I wrote it many, many years ago, and I'm not sure what kind of direction it's going to take and whether or not it'll actually appear in the book. But there was a whole struggle around that's called the Joanne Little campaign in North Carolina in the early 70s, and I was really deeply moved at the time around her struggle. She was jailed, and the story was that her jailer, white guy, tried to rape her, and she murdered him, killed him, murdered him, depending upon your perspective. And I sort of thought the self-defense argument was the rang true with me, and then but the whole her trial in North Carolina and all that, being from North Carolina, totally fascinated me. So around 2000, I wrote a chapter. That was one of the chapters that I wrote. The problem is that subsequently other people have written about this, including Danielle McGuire at the Dark End of the Street. And so I don't know if that, what I'm going to do with that. But I do have some other stuff. I'm totally fascinated by Sweet Honey in the Rock. I'm totally fascinated by women's political music, and I just see Sweet Honey as a window onto sort of an emerging, black womanist politics that speaks across a lot of boundaries. And so I've written about that. None of that's published, but that's one thing. And third world politics, sort of how people, especially having lived and worked in the Bay Area, and I think this is one of the things that catalyzes the Black Panther Party in fascinating ways. People working across class boundaries, people working across ethno-racial boundaries, and working meaning struggling. This notion that everybody's always totally successful at everything they do and everything works out. No, but solidarity work is important in my way of thinking about this. So the Panthers were totally into this kind of work, and so and what I see is that a lot of social movements and political movements in the Bay Area was into that. So I have a conversation around that. I have worked with a variety of graduate students over the years who've been interested in this, labor movements especially. Say, for example, support a graduate student who did a fascinating dissertation and book on sort of the United Farm Workers and sort of the ways in which groups like the Panthers supported and aided them in mobilizations and organizations and protests and all that kind of stuff. And I think, to me, this is hardcore politics. And when people think about sort of the United Farm Workers, or when they think about the Black Panther Party, what they don't think about is sort of how a lot of these groups work together and supported one another on particular campaigns. And so, a student who did it, Lauren Reza, who did a wonderful book around that. So I have a conversation around third world politics. And I think that's particularly relevant as we go forward, because I think the whole world is becoming much more diverse everywhere, especially in the United States. And so trying to think about how you organize on the ground sort of struggled around these issues and quote unquote learned from what they were able to do or what they weren't able to do.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate talking with you.
Oh, well, hopefully you got something that you can use. All I can say is that I've known Stanley for a while. Josh and I talked to Stanley a lot about the making of this film, and I know the book helped to shape some of his vision, but he had lots of things to look at and lots of things to read. But so if you want to hear more about what I think, come tomorrow night. But I think tonight we want to talk about the film. This is about my 4th time seeing it, so I have a lot to say about it. But what I think most important is for you to, make your own comments. If you have a question, that I, as a historian, someone who's talked to Stanley and the team about the film. I was recently on a program with Stanley in San Rafael, California, talking about the film with Erica Huggins. And it's been playing in the Bay Area for about a month now, and my students are loving it, even at $8 a pop. You're going to be...
Yeah, so I'm going to be moderating. I'm going to be doing the Oprah thing, running around. So I'm sure there's a lot to talk about. If we want to just open it up to the audience.
Yeah, no. I mean, let me put it to you this way. A documentary is a special kind of work. I think Stanley is one of the premier documentary filmmakers of our time. He has an extraordinary track record. Most recently, he's done work on freedom rides, Freedom Summer, film on the Jonestown massacre, film on the Black Press, a film on Garvey. I mean, his work is pretty stellar across a whole range of topics. I know he worked on this film for, I think, about 7 years to bring it to the screen. I think the proof is in the pudding. I'm a historian. I come at this material differently. I think this is visually, I think the party comes alive here. And so I think what we need to do is I want to hear what you have to say, and if there's something I can do to sort of push forward the conversation, that's how I see my role. I'm not here to lecture about the film. Yeah, I think we've been here for 2 hours, so no lectures. I'm just interested in hearing what you have to say, and maybe we can generate conversation. Okay, I think there's...
All right, I see that. No, run over.
He's going to do the...
Hi, I just wanted to ask, do you personally know whether certain people were strategically or refused to be a part of this film? Because there's some pieces I remember growing up, Soledad Brothers and Angela Davis and Sada Shakur, that were not talked about in this film, and I'm thinking they are the essential elements of this story.
Okay, the people who chose to, who agreed to participate are in the film. Other people were asked, and some of them chose not to be a part of it. Angela was technically not a member of the party, so even though she's huge, if you're trying to understand the particular context in which the party operates, and she did support and solidarity work with the party. So I think, and Shakur is in Cuba. I think this is a question that Stanley was asked, but I think that was sort of his response. Some people chose, for a variety of reasons, not to be a part of the film. And, when you do a documentary, you basically agree to trust the choices that the filmmaker makes. And, some people, for whatever reason don't, you know what I mean? They have their own ideas, they don't want to be a part of it, so.
All right, got you right here.
Yeah, I enjoyed the documentary very much, but I also recognize that a documentarian has, like any filmmaker, but a filmmaker with a particular mission, has to make certain choices. And I guess the choice to have the first person narrative or from the standpoint of the individuals and who either through the the original film, the original text, or the original speakers, or those who are giving testimony, that's different from a documentarian having a narrator. And so, because I guess one thing that struck me, although I got over it, I'm fine, but one thing that struck me was the history of the context of the party. Now, the documentary, is, to be fair, is 2 hours long, and so there's only but so much you can bring in. And I know Stanley Nelson's work, certainly Marcus Garvey. But what struck me at first was sort of a little bit of a background of the history of black nationalism and revolutionary nationalism that led up to the party, from the ways in which Newton and Seal would have given credit to Malcolm X, or even sort of the founding of the party, at San Francisco State. So I think just some of those elements, it may be more difficult from the first person, but those are this. If you know what some of this history, I didn't live it, but I know it by virtue of having studied it. Yeah, there's things you can point out. Overall, I think it is quite successful, but there's always choices to be made. I guess that would be my observation.
I appreciate that, and that is a very pointed and I think astute comment that I have nothing more to say about. You said it as well as it. Anybody else want to?
All right, I'm gonna make it to you real quick.
One of the things that I've run across in my studies of the Black Panthers is the scorn that they had for the group of people they call cultural nationalists. And there was a big rift, which was started by the FBI between the Panthers and the US organization. And I didn't see that mentioned anywhere in the film either. Would you be able to fill in that gap for us now that you have the mic?
Well, let me put it to you this way. The book that Josh and I wrote deals a lot with sort of that particular view. It became important and why the party was important. I think these kinds of moments within sort of the Black Power struggle and the various organizations and tactics and strategies, obviously, as the brother put it over here, was something that a film like this couldn't tackle. We try to do some of it in the book, but it's pretty complicated stuff. But my way of thinking about Karinga is to really center sort of, there are politics there. It's just that the role that culture plays in the politics is much more important and much more centered. And Karinga's still around.
Yeah.
You can go to LA and ask.
I also enjoyed the documentary very much, and I guess my comment and my question has more to do with a backstory. The FBI and its role is very central to what went on with the Black Panther Party. But have you done any research on the racial identity of J. Edgar Hoover? Because it's rumored that he was a light-skinned brother.
Let me be very honest. I cannot neither confirm nor deny that, and it is not. It's not something that we personally researched. We read a lot of FBI files. We read all the pertinent sort of FBI documents, and whether he was a brother or not, he was a vicious man. And so what we were trying to understand were his actions. And but I've actually heard this, but I don't know of any confirmation of that. So.
One of the fascinating parts is the way that the film brings out how they exploited the media. And in another part of the film, it talks about how they were kind of running on a shoestring budget, but I didn't see the 2 points connected as well as I thought it might, where I've read and seen other places where it talks about how they used the media to display a sense of organization and power and having everything together more than was really there. Can you comment on that?
First off, I think there is no single party. You know, one of the problems, and I think the beginning talks about this. If you go from 1966 to the party's demise in the late 70s, early 80s, the party goes through various phases. At its height, you know, there's a lot of stuff happening, and there's a lot of money running through the party. By the end of the party, it's a shell of its former self, and at the beginning, it's basically a local organization in Oakland that blows up. So I think to answer your question, you know, we'd have to talk about, are we going to focus on the Oakland-based party, or are we going to focus on the almost 50 chapters that were created at the height of the party's existence? Those chapters are extraordinary, and that's where a lot of the work of the party actually took place. And those organizations tended to operate on more of a shoestring, right? The Oakland-based party was the party through which a lot more of the funds funneled. And the New York chapter, that whole thing with the New York chapter and the Oakland chapters, sort of part of that whole struggle. So at its height, late 60s, you know, early 70s, the organization has more resources than it ever had. And then, you know, it becomes, you know, the resources dwindle if you're talking about money and networks and all of that. The other way to think about the party, however, is to not simply focus from the top down, but to understand the people who make up the party and the work that the people actually do. And a lot of the work continues. This is the other thing. The party may not exist as the party, but breakfast programs, free medical care programs, food giveaway programs continue. People who are in the party are also affiliated with and become part of other movements. So I think another way to think about this is that the party is not the only organization on the block, and they are not the only organization doing some of this kind of work. There are other Black Power organizations doing this kind of work. So a lot of the work is picked up by other organizations, and other Pan-African organizations, all kinds of organizations doing different kinds of things. And I think that's another thing that you can't really get in the film, because I think that's a very hard thing to represent, sort of the range of organizations and the range of activities of those organizations and the relationship of the party to a lot of that. Even in the Bay Area, at its beginning, the Black Panther Party that you see here was not the only Black Panther Party. It comes to be the dominant one, but that comes out of a Bay Area struggle.
Oh, one over here.
I enjoyed the documentary, but the other night I heard an interview on satellite radio where Elaine Brown, while she did participate in the documentary, refuted several of the, I guess the director's biases, and her problem was the fact that the Cleavers played a major role, and according to her, they really were only in the party 1 year and were comfortably living in Algeria. She also talked about how the Stanley Nelson had some issues with Huey and his problems with addiction, and maybe he might have had some addiction issues as well. So I'm just wondering if you were aware of that interview, and it was about a 20-minute interview that she did with Dr. Wilma Leon.
Let me be very honest. Elaine Brown has made her some of her criticisms quite well known, and I do not, you know, it's not for me to come back and criticize Elaine. But let me put it to you this way. Elaine was in the party at a different moment, and Elaine's experience of the party was very different. By the time Elaine really becomes prominent in the party, indeed, the Cleavers are no longer on the stage. I think Kathleen Cleaver represents her role in the party, especially the creation of the Free Huey campaign, which literally helps to make the party well. That is the campaign which catalyzes the party, expands the base, and really helps to create a series of networks, especially local networks and national and to some extent international networks are absolutely essential. And I think she sort of represents some of that. And then I think the moment where Elaine is really prominent in the party is different. And I think they have different politics in terms of, you know, when they were active in the party. I mean, I think that whole idea about social service programs, the function of these survival pending revolution programs, or whether or not we're more committed to armed self-defense and the role of armed self-defense in the party, you know, that sort of tactical political thing. I think there's some real differences there. And so, you know, and I think Elaine Brown represents herself very well. I think Kathleen Cleaver represents herself very well. I think it's incumbent upon those of you who are interested in this to hear both of them out and make up your own mind. In terms of the representation of Huey, Huey was a very complicated brother. And I think this film doesn't begin to really give you, I think, a full view because it's not a biography of Huey. And I think if you're interested in that, I think you really have to look at the whole of Huey's life. But I do think that some of Huey's political acumen, some of his sort of political understanding is not as clearly apparent here as it might be, because he was, in a lot of ways, sort of a mind, and a lot of his thinking helped to shape the party in profound ways. And so, you know, he also had, you know, other kinds of things happening in his life. And I think the last thing I'll say about this is that the party was not Huey Newton. You know, Huey Newton was the founder and the titular leader and all that other kind of stuff. But the party was the people who made up the party. The party was the people who believed in it and did the work. And so it's like, you know, if you're only going to focus on the leadership and not understand that the rank and file and the chapters and all this other stuff is fundamentally where the action is, I think that's another sort of thing that I think the party does. I mean, I think this film does a pretty good job of that. But I think it perhaps lingers a bit too long on Huey's problems, but I think Huey's problems do play into the party is already unraveling, the party is already falling apart, and then his own problems play into that. But there are other things. I mean, the government is not only, you know, there's repression, there's co-optation, there are a whole lot of things happening in this period. You know, the government is beginning to respond with a whole range of programs on its own to try to undermine the appeal of groups like the Black Panther Party. There's a lot of stuff happening. Okay, right.
Yes, I enjoyed the documentary myself. I just thought it was kind of interesting that Bobby Seale is still living, and they had earlier showings of him doing interviews, but there's no interviews of him in this movie right here. You know, that was his record, and he's one of the the original leaders of the Black Panther Party itself. You know, so you know, for me, it's credibility. You know, if you don't have one of the main leaders of the Black Panther Party, and you can't get an interview with him, you know, can you speak to that?
I think you've spoken to it. I can't. I think Bobby has his own. You know, he has a film that he wants to make. I know this. I think there were. I think they both tried to see if they could have a meeting of the minds about Bobby's participation, and apparently it didn't work out. That's my sort of understanding. But I think your view of it, you know, I think there are a number of people who chose not to participate, and their motivations, their intentions, I think they must speak for themselves. I think there is an interview, I've read an interview with Bobby where he sort of speaks to this. And I think Elaine, even though she's agreed to sit for the film, ultimately disagrees with the final product. And there's some other Panthers who have expressed, there are Panthers who praised it, and there are former Panthers who, have some criticisms.
All right. Oh, let's see, right here.
Hello, so I did read the book, and one of the things that...
But brother, we're talking about the film tonight.
Okay. But one of the things that strikes me about the film, is I don't feel like the film really does a great job in portraying many of the allies that the Black Panther Party had across America, whether it be the SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, or they linger on Hollywood funding as their main allies, but I don't think it does a great job of showing the other, speaking to the ways in which they actually built allies across the nation in a way, or across the world, and actually trying to express a way of anti-imperialism in a great way. I don't think that the film actually did that in the best way that it could. But I don't know if other people feel that way. That's how I feel, and I'll speak more about it another time.
I'd like to go ahead and ask a question. The film, obviously, it definitely towards the end kind of detailed, what possibly could have gone wrong in terms of leading towards the unraveling of the Black Panther Party. And I was wondering if there were to be any lessons that you could probably distill, if there were to be anything, in today's society that could possibly, do things that, like, in similar nature, bring, police brutality to the forefront and hold people accountable for that, or any other kind of thing. What lessons could be gleaned from that, from the whole experience?
How would I put this? I think the lessons from the experience of the party are not always that different from lessons that radical revolutionary groups in this country throughout our history have the lessons are pretty clear. I think one of the lessons is that the empire will strike back. And so, when you go on this path, I think you really have to be dedicated to it, and you really have to have a sense of the perils and the prospects. And I think the party, to some extent, did. But as you heard, they didn't have a roadmap for this. But if you know anything about the history of radical and revolutionary movements in this country, from communists, anarchists, all kinds of black radicals previously, they get stomped on. These movements typically get stomped on. So, I think if you're committed to this, you have to be committed to it. You have to really have a sense of the perils and the prospects. The other thing that I think is clear, and I think the brother back here in the middle pointed to this, is that if this is your path, if you're going to be an above ground party as opposed to an underground party, then I think you really have to have allies, you have to create coalitions, you have to have networks, and you have to figure out how to speak to as wide and as meaningful an audience as possible. And I think that's what the party did at its height, and I think that's one of the reasons it assumed and was able to realize a certain kind of importance. The other thing is lessons that we learned, nothing new, is that white supremacy is alive and well. It was alive and well then, it's alive and well now. I think other kinds of lessons, the evils of capitalism were clear then, the evils of capitalism are clear now. The imperative of struggle, the change that people want is not going to come from the top. It never has, it never will. Frederick Douglass told us that's in the 19th century. if you want change, you have to make the change that you want to see. And the people make the change. The government responds to the demands of the people. So I think one of the really audacious and important aspects of the party was this was just, you know, two guys from the party started, you know, local community college, you know, about 15 minutes from where I live now. That's one of the first offices, this bakery that I go to. You know, now it's not the same office, obviously, but so it began, and there was no sense that this would become the organization that it ultimately became. So, you know, I think the other lesson is that if you're committed to this, I think you have to be committed to it as a long distance runner. And even if the form, say for example, the party might no longer exist, you know, typically people who are committed to this kind of struggle will stay committed to this kind of struggle. And that's what I applaud. The people in this film that I know are still fighting, still doing awesome community work, you know, still trying to figure out how to make the system more equitable, fairer, you know, achieve justice. How do we get the remaining Panthers unjustly incarcerated out? You know, people are struggling around those kinds of issues. The whole mass incarceration crisis that people like to talk about. This was something that the party was talking. I mean, the unfair elements of the criminal. Well, what I call with my students the criminal injustice system. How do you where does that start? You know, what is it like in this period? I think the party was speaking to that. So I mean, I think there are lots of lessons, but to me, the key lesson is the imperative of struggle. Without struggle, there is no progress. You know, you aren't going to get it because the president decides out of noblesse oblige that nice people, you deserve this. No, the people have to organize. They have to demand, and out of the organization, the demand, the mobilization, that's where change comes. At least that's been my experience in this world. You know, and I think the party practiced that. Okay,
Right.
there's someone down here. Why don't you just take that thing?
Could you just quickly tell us a little bit about the 20 guys still in prison? I mean, like, just
Well,
the kinds of,
Yeah,
kinds
well,
of
well,
crimes.
a lot of them are on, you know, life sentences, and a lot of them, most of them that I know there are groups that are supporting and groups that are trying to do work to, you know, have their either have them freed or the you know, get new lawyers or doing. There's a lot of support work, and email me and I can.
I'm curious what kind of people they were convicted for.
All you know, did you see? Yeah, basically bullshit. But you know, there are all kinds of ways you can frame people for murder, for all kinds of things, and a lot of you know, a lot of it.
All right, we got time for one more question. All right. You gotta come.
So to your earlier point, has change really come? What do you think the party has accomplished? How are things different now?
Well, let me be very honest. I think the party, in its short history, accomplished a lot because I think it moved the country in a more progressive direction, and I think it was a place for people interested in progressive change to try to achieve that, and in some communities and in some places they did that. So I don't think it's incumbent upon the party to change the nation. I think the party did what it could do given the world that it found itself in. But you know, I mean, we live in the same world, and I'm sure we have the same concerns about lingering patterns of injustice and all of that. But I do think that, you know, depending upon the window you look out of or you look into, you know, the glass can be half empty, the glass can be half full. And I do think that what I don't practice is hopelessness, despair, nihilism, and cynic, or, you know, this notion that since nothing ever changes, there's no point in doing anything. I don't believe in that at all. I think that things can be better, there can, you know, and I don't, and as I said, if you want, you have to be the agent of the change that you want to see in the world. I mean, that's not original to me, but I get that from everybody I talk to who's ever done anything of note. And so I'm heartened by especially the young people who continue to push forward the boundaries of activism, you know, Black Lives Matter and all of that. And I'm also heartened by long distance runners, you know, people I know in their 90s and on who are still fighting the good fight. And I think the important thing is that we have to support and sustain them, and to the extent possible, join them in that struggle, you know, because I don't believe, you know, that old blues song, I'm gonna throw up both of my hands and holler, what's the use? The fate of humanity is what's the fate of the world that we're gonna give, you know, our children and our grandchildren. That's what's the use. We want to give them a better world.
Wonderful. Well, that's a great note to end on. Thank you, guys. Give it up for Waldo and Martin. Again, it's going to be available tomorrow at 6 at the University at Pettigrew College.